Mindhunter is probably the best crime show on Netflix, and this year's season didn't drop the ball at all. The show is unique in that it avoids the spectacle of murder and instead prioritizes the motives of the criminal mind. It's not about how the crimes were committed, but why they were committed. With David Fincher at the helm, it's hard to find an error with the actual makeup of the show. Well, apart from the makeup. Jeez, why does everyone look so yellow in this season? Anyway, my point is, you can tell this show was filmed by the best in the business. I'm certain the show won't be 100% historically accurate, but how these scenes are constructed is what interests me the most. I remember enjoying the first season, but it wasn't until I'd finished binging the second that I realized that this show is deliberately filmed in a way that leaves you uncomfortable and disturbed. In this video, I'm going to analyze the interviews the members of the behavioral science unit conducts to see what creative and technical decisions incited discomfort in this year's season of Mindhunter. So strap in and let's uncover the secrets to this show's success. The first interview of the season is with the brother of a BTK victim. Kevin is shown initially as a small silhouette, seen in the tiny reflection of the car's wing mirror. The moment he gets in the car, we see Detective Drawotsky's gun mounted right above the passenger seat. This shot was intentional in that Kevin was shot at the scene, and having this gun protrude the frame so starkly indicates the weight of his psychological wound. Throughout the scene, Kevin is shown out of focus or with a hidden face. The damage done to his face is evidently too shocking to comprehend or for the audience to see. As the camera shows Kevin out of focus, the gun appears to be going straight through his head, a scar he has to bear, but without showing us the injury directly. We also have Tench being forced to face forward as a requirement for this interview, so having Kevin out of focus and forcing the audience to listen to his voice allows us to empathize with Tench's position. Outside of the vehicle, we hear the soundscape of trains grinding on rails above, adding to the intensity building up as the scene progresses. Detective Drawotsky acts almost as a referee for the interview, giving Tench looks of concern or nodding when he gives emotional support to the victim. By the end, however, he looks directly at the victim and also at the audience. The camera was previously positioned in the back seats of the car, and now one is positioned right where the lad would be sitting, giving us Kevin's point of view. Drawotsky looks directly into the lens, with him being almost bang in the center of the frame. This rather disturbing shot makes us feel ashamed for making him relive that experience again. Despite the detective's intention of calming Kevin down, the remainder of the interview is blown as Kevin steps out of the vehicle and walks away. So we start the season with a rather unconventional interview, that of a victim, not a perpetrator. This is a clue that our protagonists will be helping ongoing investigations instead of crafting research this year, just as the new overseer of the BSU wants to put their efforts into practice. The next interview on the agenda is with David Berkowitz, also known as Son of Sam. The scene kicks off with this well-placed shot of the criminal's face placed center frame surrounded by a square of chain link fence. This describes his perceived importance as though he's ready to be interviewed for TV, not for science. Most of the shots of him at the beginning of the scene are center framed, not because of the significance of his killings, but because of how he perceives himself. When Holden starts to press him, we see he's pushed slightly to the left and then slightly to the right. From here, he's not shown directly in the center again until his other personality comes out. Before the scene, the pair were informed that Berkowitz was a schizophrenic, and I think these shots were trying to give off this impression. As the scene goes on, though, it becomes clear to the agents his second personality is practically non-existent, instead choosing to have these quack ideas about possession in order to make money. The Exorcist sells at cinemas, and suddenly he's got a get-rich-quick scheme, albeit with a prison sentence attached. As the truth comes out, there are moments when close-ups are cut in very sharply like this.
I study maps, escape routes, I carry my gun, little quarters for parking. You never know when it might come together. No, I hunt it every night.
Every night.
That's what it takes. Commitment.
These cuts grab your attention and emphasize the importance of their dialogue. What Berkowitz is about to describe will become very important for the rest of the season. He describes how he revisits and ritualizes the crime scenes, just as Kemper did, and his importance is reinstated, center framed, as the scene comes to a close. We then move on to the interview with William Pearce. Right from the offset, the show's creators choose to introduce the scene with a voiceover from Holden explaining why he's there. Accompanied by a shot of him pointing at his watch, this indicates that the interview has immediately gotten off on the wrong foot. By jumbling the order of the events, we get the impression that Pearce wasn't even listening to Holden, but also emphasizes Holden's character change. Not only is Holden distant from the interview physically, but the way it's filmed gives this impression too. He is positioned either further away or is filmed in this center profile without anybody else in the frame. Doing this serves two functions. Firstly, to remind the audience of the fragility of his circumstances after his panic attack, and secondly, to spark this idea of subverting public expectations. We see Jim Barney as the inexperienced agent in this scene, and with Pearce's racist comments, he is arguably a victim here too. He proves more than capable than anticipated though, and this public perception breakdown is significant for later events. None of the family members of the victims in Atlanta would hear anything other than KKK involvement, and by having Jim subvert the expectations of the audience here, we are prepared for both sides of the fence when we try to identify who is to blame for these horrific child murders. Moving aside from interviews temporarily, I want to praise the way the show handles crime scenes. The emptiness of these houses prove more sinister than the actual event itself, with subtle yet distressing music. The locations feel cold, haunted by their lighting, and their abandoned setting. With Tench imagining the gruesome events in front of him, we too picture the horror that took place in these now dark and dingy locations. The real punch, though, is that by the end of the series, Tench's own home would become as empty as those houses he wandered around, left to mull over the footprints of those that are no longer there. We now come to one of my favourite interviews of the season, Greg and Wendy's interview with Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. Henley has a lot of profile shots to give him a dominant position over these two newbie interviewers. This is also shown as the stationary shots of Henley change from near and far, mirroring his volatile behaviour. The way the camera remains in the same position on Wendy is significant. It acts as a continuous reinforcement of how much more comfortable and confident she is in talking to this violent inmate compared to her colleague. This scene makes its dramatic punches when the camera continuously breaks the 180-degree rule. For those unfamiliar with this term, this is a rule for positioning the camera when characters are conversing. The camera establishes positions of characters in the frame, so the viewer can essentially move their eyes like watching a tennis match by moving left and right between cuts as characters talk. The camera cannot go beyond a 180-degree line of positioning to prevent confusion as to where the characters are in frame for the audience. As we see in this scene, the rule is actually broken for dramatic effect quite a few times. When Greg mistakenly calls Henley by his middle name, he initially lingers on the left-hand side of the frame to build up tension, and then we have a quick cut back to Henley's center frame to snap us back after Henley shouts at him. This describes the awkward discomfort of Greg without having to see sweat running down his face or show something more obvious. After this bit, there is a long shot of the group re-establishing the placement of the characters in the frame. However, when Wendy starts describing her previously abusive relationship, she's placed on the left-hand side, with Henley taking a dominant profile shot again, and Greg reacting on the right-hand side of the frame. The most poignant use of breaking the 180 rule happens towards the end of the scene, when Henley rails against any notions of him being a homosexual. After announcing it for the first time, the camera goes to where it shouldn't be, and jumps back and forth very quickly, mind you, building up to Henley's outburst. This crazy positioning change instills discomfort, punctuated by this haunting shot of Wendy looking straight at the camera here, showing who the real successor is because she's just got a kick-ass interview out of this, reminiscent of Holden's instincts being put to good use in the first season. And now to discuss the most anticipated interview of the season, Charles Manson. As an uncultured and un-American swine, I actually had no idea what Charles Manson looked like before this episode. I, honest to God, only knew of him from the opening of Death Grips' mixtape, so take what you will from that. Manson has to make his presence felt, because he certainly can't do it with his physical presence alone, so he sits on the back of the chair to make him taller than the agents, with a low-angled shot to make him look even taller and more powerful. Holden seems to shrink down when he pushes the microphone closer to him, almost almost as though he's bowing to him. There's evidently hidden respect for Manson from Holden, whereas Tench is having none of it. The shot behind Manson is pointed downwards from a high angle to make the agents appear smaller. As the conversation progresses, we see less shots with both Tench and Holden in frame together. With Holden excited and intrigued and Tench plagued by his home life, a wedge is drawn between them, as though Manson is having two conversations simultaneously, created by this carefully thought out camera work. After Tench calls Manson a midget, it's followed up by a shot of the three slowly zooming in, once again making Manson look like the divider and growing in size the longer he's allowed to talk. He stands up and suddenly he's the biggest separator we can possibly imagine, his arms spread out like the cross with a really low angle encapsulating this stark image with a punch. As a side note, I think they did a flipping good job of shoving in as many crosses into this season as they could, an image seen so frequently across America that would definitely have a profound psychological effect on Tench after what his son did to that toddler. Only once Manson's got Tench feeling ashamed does he sit, looking as small as when he was brought in, enough to convince Holden to hand over his sunglasses. And now for some speculation. I'd be interested to hear what you guys think of this, but when the agents enter at the beginning, Tench says Manson is entering
like a fucking king.
And as the agents leave, I can't help but wonder if there's some connection to Elvis Presley here. With the sunglasses on his face, Manson says,
Think you kinda.
It's certainly not the infamous, "Thank you very much," but it would appear as though Manson is attempting to embody the position of fame once held by Elvis, who died only a few years before the events of this series. Or maybe Manson was just a big fan of the guy. Just a thought. The final interview of the season with Wayne Williams is the most unique of the bunch. Alongside the subject being a suspect, not an inmate, this interview acts as the closing of the interview loop structure. The season starts with an interview with a victim, and the very middle episode, episode 5, has the biggest interview of them all with Charles Manson, who is anything other than a victim. The final episode closes this structure with somebody who's going to eventually become an inmate, but in the eyes of Atlanta, at this point in the story, Wayne can be seen as a victim of institutional racism despite fitting the profile. The ambiguity of what category this guy falls under makes this scene terrifically tense. The notion that there's only the psychological theory as the basis for prosecution looms heavily over the interview. As the scene begins, we see a reflection of Holden in the glass. This reflection is significant because the burden now lies on Holden to get something, anything out of Wayne to get him convicted. When we get inside, a shot of Wayne is shown from down below as though the camera was placed on the table, not too dissimilar from the previous framing of Manson. As the more authoritative members of the investigation enter to watch, the camera rises and points down slightly to indicate the pressure is on. Wayne is often positioned to look small in the frame as the interview progresses, and as the agents press him. The agents question Wayne about the specifics of his victims, and the shot displays him squeezed in between the pair with his face remaining uninterested and bored. The moment Wayne begins to describe himself in the third person, he's positioned in center frame, alone, and this happens a few times in the scene. We could deduce from the Son of Sam interview that this is evidence of schizophrenia, but I think the camera appears to be highlighting the significance of something else, as though his reputation is taking precedence over his own thoughts. When the agents show him the photographs of corpses, the shot presents Wayne as being completely surrounded, reacting in the same arrogant fashion, but definitely pushed into a corner here. We return to this shot of him center frame, where he makes his fatal mistake, denying that he panicked when choking a victim and then correcting himself that he didn't kill at all. The interview concludes with a final center profile shot where he resigns in the third person. Unfortunately, as the agents know, this isn't enough to convict, and the scene ends with this rather jarring shot looking down on the three men. The camera has returned to a higher angle with Wayne placed right at the top of it. He is still seemingly out of reach, with the agents left at the bottom, and it's clear from this shot alone who is leaving the police station free, but only temporarily. Thanks for watching. What did you think of Mindhunter Season 2? Don't forget to subscribe and check out my Patreon page if you want to see more content like this in the future. I look forward to reading your comments or joining us in for a chinwag on my Discord server. Link is in the description below, where we will continue this discussion. Still going? Yeah, we're still going.